2025-26 season was not a success for the Toronto Maple Leafs, to put it mildly, and so they enter this offseason needing to make drastic changes. And already we've had some big changes from the Toronto Maple Leafs, from a new general manager to hints that possibly their captain might not be around in the blue and white at the start of the 26-27 season. But what should the Maple Leafs do if they want to have a successful offseason? Welcome to the first edition of Fix Your Franchise, where I go through all of the non-playoff teams and break down what would constitute a good offseason for them. And the first thing we have to do is define what exactly would be a good offseason for the Maple Leafs, because not every team is going to go into the offseason with the same goals. Some are in a rebuild, some are taking the final steps in completing their rebuild, and some are just teams with bad luck that are going to be playoff bound next year. But before we look into the roster building aspect of the offseason, we have to start with the organizational side. The Toronto Maple Leafs, before the season even ended, fired their general manager Brad Treliving, so they're in need of a new one. And there was a lot of thought that with a new general manager, this could be the end for their head coach Craig Berube, even though he had gotten the vote of confidence from ownership, which always works out well. While I would have had some suggestions of who the Maple Leafs should hire as general manager, they already went out and hired their guy, John Chayka, a guy who hasn't been in the NHL for 5 years, was suspended by the NHL before he ended his career there, has been working in analytics along with his sister, and before that was the youngest general manager of the Arizona Coyotes, who were absolutely terrible under his stewardship. That's the guy that the Toronto Maple Leafs decided should be running their ship. And already there's been a lot of drama around this hiring. Of course, there was that bizarre press conference, which, by the way, I don't buy the narrative that John Chayka did really well at that press conference just because he didn't put his foot in his mouth as often as Keith Pelly. He never even acknowledged the missteps that he took in Arizona, barely talked about any on-ice learnings or philosophies that he's shifted his mindset in or adapted in the time away from the NHL. He talked a lot about things like leveraging capital and organizational structure, which to me is a huge red flag of this guy is going to be a mouthpiece for ownership. So good luck with that, because if I had actually gone through and given a list of candidates who the Toronto Maple Leafs should look into, there would be a list a mile long of candidates that I would say are terrible that I would still take over John Chayka. Like, this is just not a serious candidate to be hiring, in my opinion, which is why I'm actually completely fine with them keeping Craig Berube as head coach, because I don't want John Chayka hiring a new head coach. Are you kidding me? Like, he might legitimately rehire Mike Babcock or friggin' go after Mike Bilberry. Like, take the worst candidate you can imagine, and I think John Chayka could get under that bar. But, let's live in the fantasy world where John Chayka is like an actual competent human GM and go through the breakdown of what he should be doing this offseason. If you've watched me, in the past I've said that there are 8 players that every team needs if they want to be a legit Stanley Cup contender. So the first step is to just take a census and determine how many of those players the Maple Leafs already have on their roster. So as you can see, here is the final lineup for the Toronto Maple Leafs at the end of the season, including their best prospects and players on IR, which there were a lot at the end, including, of course, Matthews, Chris Tanev, Brandon Carlo, Dakota Joshua, and goalie Anthony Stolarz. And when you break down what a lineup for the Toronto Maple Leafs could look like just with the players that they already have under contract for next year, you can see that they already have a lot of pieces that you would need for a team that wants to be a Stanley Cup contender. So in my opinion, there's not really a ton of work that needs to be done for the Maple Leafs from a roster building perspective. As you can see by next year's roster projection, they have a legitimate number 1 center in Austin Matthews, a legitimate top line winger in William Nylander. Not just a very solid second line center, but one of the higher end second line centers in my opinion in John Tavares. They've got a bunch of guys who would be at least top 4 on a Stanley Cup contending team on the back end, including Morgan Rielly, Jake McCabe, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Chris Tanev. And then while neither Woll nor Stolarz on their own are legitimate top end starting goaltenders, between the two of them, they're a solid tandem. I think you could at least make a deep run in the playoffs with those two in net for you, when if one gets cold, the other can step in for them. So of those 8 key positions that Stanley Cup contending teams have locked down, the Maple Leafs honestly only really need 2 of them, a number 1 defenseman and another top 6 winger. Matthew Knies has kind of been flirting with that area of being a top 6 winger, and he's young enough that you could theoretically hope that he'll develop into that role next year. But then the Maple Leafs won the draft lottery, so they can draft at first overall a player who will step right in and perhaps even be a top 6 winger right away in Gavin McKenna. Now, before we look into upgrading the team, we do still have to do the housekeeping of bringing back the players already on the roster but who aren't under a contract for next year. I think Matias Maccelli is probably not going to be back next year. He would be due an extension around $3 million a year. Given that Craig Berube wasn't really using him that much this year, I don't think he'll be back for that price. Calle Jarnkrok could be back. He would demand probably under $1 million a year. He'd be a fine depth piece, but they could move off of him as well. I think Nick Robertson will be back. He's a solid bottom 6 contributor. For Troy Stecher, he would be a perfectly fine 5th or 6th defenseman if you can keep the price low. And the same would be said for guys like Quillen and Villeneuve, who are young, would be depth pieces and not command a lot of money. So if you re-sign all of those guys, who I project that they would, they'll still have around $14 or $15 million in cap space to spend and potentially get a number 1 defenseman. And luckily for them, there are 2 guys who are pending free agents who fit the bill of a number 1 defenseman, those being Darren Radish of the Tampa Bay Lightning and John Carlson of the Anaheim Ducks / Washington Capitals. Now, both of these guys would come with tremendous risk. For Radish, it's a lack of consistent production. He is 30 years old, still in the prime of his career, but he's only put up number 1 defensive metrics for really the last couple of years, and that was with Tampa, who have always just been able to get more out of players than any other team can. So I don't know why the Toronto Maple Leafs would think that they could continue to make Darren Radish a number 1 defenseman. For John Carlson, it's age. He's about to turn 37. You wouldn't want to give him a very loaded up contract, and you especially wouldn't want to give him the kind of term that he would be asking for. And then also, if he's going to a new city, a new location, he's chasing a cup, and I don't know if Toronto's the place to go and do that. Not going after those guys in free agency, not a whole lot of viable avenues to get a number 1 defenseman. So maybe the alternative is to see if you can swing a trade for a very good young defenseman who's not quite a number 1 but could develop into one. But again, those guys are not going to be out there and they're not going to be available for cheap. But even if the Maple Leafs don't go into next season with a lockdown number 1 defenseman on their roster, they still have a lot of the pieces necessary to return to being a contending team next year. Of course, the problem is that they are going into it with a GM that I have no confidence in, a head coach who looked cooked throughout the end of this year, and a roster that was largely in shambles. So there might be an inclination to gut the whole thing and start over. But in my opinion, the answer's kind of simple. Get in a time machine, don't hire John Chayka, hire literally anybody from one of the competent teams like Dallas, Carolina, Colorado. Berube go get a good young coach, bring back your core and add to it with McKenna, and you'll return to being a competitive team pretty quickly. With Berube, with Chayka, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I can tell you if the Maple Leafs do fail to make the playoffs again next year, it's not going to be from a lack of talent.